Okay, good morning and welcome. So let's continue with our next Psych 1000 lecture, and this chapter will be a chapter 10 on social psychology. Alrighty, so let me pull up my screen. And here we go. All right, social psychology. So what is this area of psychology about? Well, as the term suggests, it's about social relationships. Yeah. Generally, in our discussion about psychology, we've been focused on the individual because that is the nature of psychology, is focused on the individual human behavior, right? Behavior broadly defined. Um, and that's generally the emphasis of psychology. Here, social psychology, the emphasis is the same, okay, from the perspective of the individual. But here we're talking about how groups, yeah, be it ethnic, racial group, national group, temporary work situation at school or in employment, how though all those multiple ways every day that we're in groups, yeah, how groups and group dynamics, group behavior affects the individual. Okay, so that's the idea. Whereas sociology is examination of group behavior, many of the groups that I just identified, but the focus of analysis is essentially the group itself, alrighty? Whereas with social psychology, the focus is on the individual, but as groups affect the individual, alrighty? So you'll see that in our discussion about, say, prejudice, our discussion about attraction, and so on. Alrighty. So without further ado, let's continue. Okay. Oh, this is our debate wins. We'll maybe touch on this when we meet face to face. It's a survey we won't do now. We might do later. So social psychology. Yeah, it's about the ways groups affect how we think and how they influence and relate, how they influence us and how individuals relate to one another in a group. All right. Now, one of the in this lecture, in this discussion, we're going to focus on some of the common themes or areas that social psychology typically does research in. Now, one area that social psychology has and continues to do research in is in the area of how we try to explain other people's behavior or understand other people's behavior. Okay. Part of understanding how the group affects us is understanding how we tend, when in groups, yeah, we explain others' behavior. Yeah, our theories, our own personal hypotheses or explanations or attributions of other people's behavior. Yeah, because because when we try to explain others' behavior, those explanations we have in our mind, those theories, those ideas affect our behavior. Yeah. And then we have this kind of complex dynamic interaction between our explanations for others' behavior and others' attributions of our behavior and other individuals' behavior or the group's behavior. Yeah. So attributing how we attribute other people's behaviors or our explanations of other people's behavior can explain for a lot of the variance, right? A lot of the ways that people's behavior can vary or differ. So attribution theory is a theory or framework that tries to explain how we attribute behavior to either internal or external dispositions, okay? Internal dispositions or external situations, sorry, all righty. Now, the idea with attribution theory is that when we're in a situation, be it social, work, or what have you, we try to make explanations for people's behavior. So, for example, if someone acted rudely to me, right, I might either make an internal attribution like, oh, they're a jerk, or maybe let's just say we're in a crowded room where a lot of people, where there's a lot of busy stuff going on, people are highly stressed, and someone, kind of bumped into me without apologizing, right? I could make an internal attribution like say, oh, they're a louse, right? They're a bad person, a no good Nick, right? Those are some nice words we could say. Or I might attribute their behavior to the situation, the environment, the external situation. Oh, they bumped into me. They didn't excuse me, but it's highly stressful. Everyone's distracted. Everyone's kind of stressed out. This is a stressful situation, right? Maybe it's at the polling booth for an election. Alrighty. So that's why the person didn't say excuse me, didn't take the time to say excuse me because they were distracted, or they were caught up in a very stressful situation. Okay, or we might do a little of both. Yeah. So that's the idea with attribution theory. It proposes that we're constantly making attributions or explanations of people's behavior, and these are two common ways we try to explain people's behavior. Yeah, very typically either or. Although maybe in some circumstances there could be a combination of the two. Now, what is the fundamental attribution error? Alrighty. Well, the fundamental attribution error proposes that as a general matter, we underestimate situational factors for others' behavior, but we're very sensitive to situational factors for our behavior. Alrighty. So for example, let's go back to being in a crowd, like in a dance club. Alrighty. You can imagine being in a dance club. It's like 2 a.m, right? Music's playing loud, all that kind of stuff. And this happens all the time in nightclubs, right? Somebody in front of you steps on your foot, right? And then they step off it, but they don't even seem to notice, right? So we might think to ourselves, what a jerk, right? Or what a dumbass or something like that, because they stepped on our foot, right? Or what a clumsy, what a klutz. Alrighty. What we're probably doing there is underestimating the situational factors in the club. What are some of the situational factors? Well, certainly people being crowded in. People are constantly like bumping into each other and so on. Yeah, it's dark, there's not music, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And so there are a number of situational factors which may account for why the person backed up, stepped on our foot, right? Stepped forward, didn't even seem to notice, didn't seem to have any reason to excuse themselves, right? There are a lot of situational factors, but the fundamental attribution error will suggest that in many situations, we're more likely to underestimate those situational factors for others' behavior and tend to make more internal attributions, right? They're a jerk, they're not paying attention, they're not attentive, something like that. Something's going on in their brain, or there's something going on with their personality, right? While at the same time, we tend to be very sensitive to situational factors for our own behavior. So for example, we very well did this too in a nightclub, right? We stepped on someone's foot and we didn't say, excuse me, because we didn't notice, right? And odds are we've done that in our lives, all right, or at a party, whatever the case may be. And then if we were confronted on it, we would probably say, oh, it's really dark in here, or someone, a lot of people pushing me, sorry, didn't notice that, but, the loud music too, right? All those things. We're very sensitive to our situational factors for ourselves, yeah, but not so much for others. Now, why might that be the case? Yeah, well, you might think, we tend to be narcissistic. You can make a personality attribution, right? We think we're great and others are jerks or something like that. You can have that theory. But what the social psych research seems to support is the reason why we tend to do that, yeah, arises from our perspective of things, yeah, where we stand. Yeah. And where we stand, we tend to be aware of what's outside, right? Because we're focused on the environment when you're walking down the street, when you're in a nightclub, and so on. Yeah. That we're very sensitive to situational factors, but it's often difficult for us, unless we make the effort, the cognitive effort, to take the other person's perspective. Yeah. How they see things from their side of the room, or as they're approaching me from the street. Right? We don't have that perspective. We have our perspective, which is of the environment, but we don't have their perspective of the environment or what went on that day in the environment for them when we didn't see them earlier in the day, or the day before, what have you, and all the other environmental circumstances that affected them, not just at that moment, but even prior to our seeing them. Yeah. So if we didn't see them additionally, we're not going to it's going to be difficult for us to see their perspective and how they viewed the world. Yeah. Whereas we see our perspective in that moment, but also earlier, before we even encountered that specific situation, earlier in the day before, and so on. Yeah. You can even take it to the entirety of your life, right? All the things that impacted you in the environment, right? People, places, things, stressors, great events, negative events that affected you, that brought you to this particular situation on the sidewalk, in the nightclub, or what have you, right? As opposed to all those situations that affected the environmental circumstances that affected the individual up to that point. We don't see that, right? We see ours for years, but we don't see the others for years, right? We only see them from our perspective, and so on. So that's probably what contributes to the fundamental attribution error. And this plays out in a lot of situations every day. Yeah. When we meet people and socialize at a nightclub, um, in a job interview, right? When we interview someone for a job, or when you think for a first date, right? Uh, and when how the person speaks, what they say, how they act, right? If they're rude, if they're sensitive, they're compassionate, they seem, crass, right? We there's an inclination for us to say, particularly in a job interview, or very often on our first date, oh, that's how that person is, right? That's something about their moral structure, or what's going on in their brain, or their personality. We mean internal attributions, right? And probably we do that in part because we want to make predictions, right? So those ideas give us the illusion, very often the illusion, that we can predict their behavior. Sometimes we may be able to predict behavior based on, future behavior based on a sampling of current behavior. But what the fundamental attribution theory will suggest is that we often do that in error. Yeah, that we don't take into account, as I just mentioned, the environmental circumstances, but we tend to be inclined to make internal attributions of others' behavior in an attempt to predict the future. And that's maybe something is helpful for us to keep in mind, are the limitations of what we see. Yeah. Now there is value to what we observe, and that should be taken into account. But social psychologists would submit that there's a value to also taking into account the fundamental attribution error, and how that might be playing in our thinking, yeah, in this social situation. Yeah. So it's not to say that, there's no point to your taking into account behavior observed, as long as you keep in mind the fundamental attribution error and how that may be at play. Not that it's always at play. It would be a very scientific way to think of things. Okay. Now, related to this, um, is the relationship between attitudes and actions. Okay. Now, is there a relationship between our beliefs, what we think, right? If we have an attitude, let's say, for example, on the political spectrum, whether we're more liberal or conservative, yeah, if we have certain attitudes about ethnic racial relations, or ethnic racial, let's get very specific, jokes, right? We have certain beliefs about those. Yeah. Let's say you have a belief that it's not funny to make racial jokes, yeah, or homosexual jokes, right? Because that's discriminatory. You have that belief system, yeah. So what's the relationship between our attitudes and beliefs, what we think, what we say to ourselves, and what we actually do? Yeah? Well, sometimes there's congruence, right? Sometimes they're consistent. Sometimes what our attitudes and beliefs allow us to make predictions about the future. Yeah, if you have a more liberal attitude, you probably will vote in a certain way. Yeah, say certain things, support certain people, and sometimes not. Yeah, sometimes other things can come into play, in particular environmental circumstances. Yeah, certain things going on in the environment, in groups of people, may influence our behavior. So, for example, let's go back to ethnic racial jokes, right? Many of you may have a belief that that's a bad thing. You shouldn't do it. Yeah. Now, imagine this situation. You're at a party, right? People are having drinks, a lot of laughing, everyone's having a good time, yeah? And then someone makes an off-color ethnic joke, alrighty? Ethnic racial joke. And people laugh and you laugh too, alrighty? Wow, why did you laugh? You had an attitude or belief against making racial jokes, alrighty? So why might someone have laughed in that situation? If you take a pause, right, you may recognize that there are a number of things going on, right? One, you're having a little alcohol, so that, maybe affected your attention, your judgment. There's a lot of laughter going on in the room. The people around you seem pleasant, right? They didn't seem like they were a member of the Ku Klux Klan or anything, right? They were all people who you've generally experienced as being pleasant, good people. And someone made this joke, and if others laughed, it probably was just something not to take seriously, so you laugh too. Right? So that's a situation where clearly I think we can all understand how the environment has an impact. But also we can understand how our attitudes may not be always consistent or congruent with our beliefs. Yeah, due to, again, the fact that we're also influenced or affected by the environment. And that one example of a racial joke at a party can play out in all kinds of different variations and permutations, yeah, where our attitudes may not be consistent with our beliefs, yeah. Um, so that's an important thing to keep in mind. Uh, there's some degree of congruence depending on the attitudes and the particular behaviors that they're related to, but that doesn't mean that they're 100% congruent. And depending on the attitude and belief, the correlation may be high or low. The other thing to keep in mind is that our attitudes may precede our behaviors. Yeah, so let's just say we have a particular work ethic, yeah, about being on time, yeah, and completing a task. Yeah, that very often, right, that attitude we learned from our parents or from school and friends, right, may take us into other situations, and or we take that or maybe we take the attitudes and beliefs into other situations, right? In our head, and our feet is taking our brain to different places, and it may precede certain behaviors, yeah, how we work at a new job. But what's also important to keep in mind is that this isn't always the case. Yeah, that very often attitudes may follow behavior. Yeah, in other words, we may act in a certain way without thinking, without being conscious of what we're doing, being affected by the environment, right? People around us, and then the way we behave may have an influence on our thoughts, right? Maybe giving us a thought or modifying our thoughts and beliefs. All righty. So let's go back with the racial joke at a party. Yeah? Maybe perhaps prior to that situation, we always had the belief that you should never, ever, ever make or laugh at a racial joke. Alrighty? Then you're at the party, that happened. Afterwards, you're thinking about it, and you go, well, maybe I shouldn't be such a Nazi about this anti-racial joke thing, maybe I should loosen up. And there are some circumstances when, you're at a party, you're, with some friends, people are laughing, people are having a good time, people who, are generally act in a good way, that it's all right for something to raise a joke. You might even think to yourself, hey, it's a way we can talk about each other and accept each other. In Hawaii, many Hawaii people have that attitude, yeah, and practice that attitude and make jokes about all the different ethnic groups in Hawaii. And sometimes that actually catches some people who just came from the continental U.S., the mainland, off guard, like, whoa, what's going on here? Also, all this ethnic racial joking around and stuff. But for many local Hawaii people, that's more of a reflection about the attitude that you can talk about these things, right? Have humor about it. Almost like the way you can joke about family members, right? You love your family members, and maybe part of accepting and loving them is being able to talk about their fallibilities and stuff. All righty. Well, you take it for what it's worth. I leave that up to you, to your judgment about Hawaii ethnic racial humor. Yeah. But getting back to the point regarding behavior and attitudes, after that party, maybe someone might be more flexible in terms of their attitude about racial humor. Yeah, not being so absolutistic about it. I didn't mean that in any small way when I joked about being a Nazi about it. Yeah, we can all sometimes be a Nazi about being anti-Nazi, um, and absolutistic and not taking into account how maybe life is complex. Yeah, and there's uh, something to be said about being more relativistic, right? And not so absolutistic, extreme, like absolutely right and wrong. Things are black and white. Maybe a lot of the time we find in life that there are a lot of shades of gray and good reasons for that. Okay, we'll kind of move past this. Okay. So as we're talking about behaviors may precede um, changes in our attitudes, may affect our attitudes. Yeah, one is the foot in the door phenomenon. As you may recall in your text reading, the foot in the door phenomenon is a social phenomenon that has been researched, well researched, and seems to have a lot of support. It's the idea that if you can set up a situation which leads a person to behave a certain manner, yeah, you can increase the likelihood that they'll behave in a way that's more likely to have that behavior occur to the same extent or to a greater frequency, intensity, or duration. Yeah. So, what's an example? Yeah, foot in the door phenomenon. And this is a very common one, common idea, and it's used all the time in sales and marketing. Yeah, that if you can get the consumer to participate in a small aspect of a behavior, right? They'll be more primed to perform that same behavior again or to a greater degree. Yeah. So, for example, the idea that the foot in the door comes from sales, door to door salespeople behavior, right? We rarely have that these days. Door to door sales, everything's Amazon, right? The idea that the person knocks on the door and the person from behind the door says, I'm not interested, right? They don't even open the damn door. Right? Salesman says, look, can I just have 30 seconds that's all I'm asking is 30 seconds of your time. And the person behind the door rolls their eyes, okay, 30 seconds, opens the door, says, okay, you got 30 seconds, right? And the salesman goes, hey, hi, my name's Joe, and blah, 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 blah. And in 30 seconds, right, says his his spiel or her spiel, whatever the case may be. Yeah. With the idea that now that the person, right, the consumer, the person behind the door, was willing to open the door and listen for a few seconds, then now the salesperson, right, has them primed, has the consumer primed to maybe listen a little more. All right. Maybe allow them into the house. Maybe take a moment for them to show the product. Maybe consider buying the product. Yeah. That with the idea that every little behavior, right, that's performed by the consumer, right, by the potential customer, yeah, that the customer on some level, when they do these things, right, it's affecting their attitude. It's affecting their attitude about the salesperson, about that moment. Yeah. Um, so before, right, the person said, no ways, I'm not going to even open the door. But when they heard the salesperson say, hey, just give me 30 seconds, right? The customer goes, ugh, all right, 30 seconds. But when they open the door, look at the other person and start investing time in listening to the person just for 30 seconds, all those behaviors, right, start affecting their attitude. Like, oh, I guess this isn't such a big deal. You know, or me, they might start thinking to themselves, why not be a little more flexible about listening to salespeople, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, which then may increase, and it does. It increases the probability, not makes it absolute. It increases the probability that they'll keep the door open longer, that they'll listen longer, and they'll do maybe some of the other stuff like letting the salesperson in that I just mentioned. All righty. Now, it's very well the case that the customer might say, okay, 30 seconds up, closes the door. That's always a possibility. But the idea with the foot in the door phenomenon is if you can get your foot in the door, have the customer or the other person do a small aspect of what you would like them to do, you've increased the probability, not guaranteed, but increased the probability that the person will behave in the same direction as the behavior you got them involved in. And the reason why is because the behavior you got them involved in changed their attitude. And there are just dozens and dozens of uh, social psych studies that have supported this phenomenon. Yeah, and that's why it's done in sales. Tons of marketing studies have shown this as well, and that's why it plays out all the time. Yeah, plays out in app market research. Yeah, you just get the person to look for a second, and that's how things like Instagram and Facebook. That's how they operate, with the idea that even when you just flash and get a person to look at a logo for a split second, yeah, that you may have already affected their attitude. Yeah, and the research shows odds are you have. Now, what is cognitive dissonance? Okay, cognitive dissonance is a really interesting phenomenon which plays out all the time, and there's again dozens of social psych studies to support this phenomenon. Okay, it's the idea that when our attitudes and behaviors don't coincide, aren't congruent, we feel some experience of dissonance, yeah, or upset, or anxiety, yeah, and an unpleasant feeling. So, for example, let's go back to the ratio joke example, right? Someone has the attitude, goes to the party, does that particular thing, laughing at a racial joke, and later is driving home, right? And they're feeling a little not so great, yeah, a little distressed. Maybe not, they're not weeping and crying into their own laps, but they're, little, feeling a little unpleasant, like, oh, why didn't I laugh at that joke, right? I have to believe that racial jokes are bad and all that kind of stuff. I just saw a video on Facebook that showed a bunch of people laughing at a racial joke, and that looked horrible, right? So we feel dissonance. Right? Now, because of that dissonance, right, what we do is we want to get away from that. Now, what's one way, a very common way, we get away from bad feelings, right? We think about it and we try to explain our behavior. Why did I do that? Yeah. And one of the things we very frequently do is we modify the attitudes, yeah, that's related to behavior, which is incongruent with our attitudes and making us feel upset, that we go back and we modify those attitudes so that we feel less upset. So one of the things we may do, as I just explained, illustrated earlier, is that we may modify that previous attitude about racial jokes and come up with a more relativistic philosophy, right? A reasonable one, not an unreasonable one. It's not like you're saying, hey, you think racial jokes are great now and you should do them all the time. You shouldn't do them all the time. But you might be more relativistic, right? Maybe in some situations it's not the worst thing in the world, and maybe it is. They can be funny and all that kind of stuff. Alrighty. So what you've done then, right? And then you'll probably feel a little better, like, ugh, okay, you know, uh, just like with the point about foot in the door, just like the point about how behaviors might affect attitudes. So by doing that, right, that sequence, right, we have the attitude, we go to the party, we're driving home feeling upset, and then we reconfigure, right, our attitudes, yeah, will decrease that dissonance, righty? And we like that, it makes us feel better. And we like having our attitudes and behaviors be consistent, all righty? So that's what cognitive dissonance is. And again, it plays out in all kinds of ways, all righty? All right. Oh, and in particular, this will happen to the extent that however we behaved earlier, it wasn't coerced by, or at least we didn't feel coerced by external circumstances. Yeah. No one told us we had to laugh. We laughed on our own and so on. Yeah. Because the less coercion we feel, pressure, right? If we felt like, hey, I better laugh or someone's going to punch me in the face, then you might reason to yourself, hey, because of the environmental circumstance, right, I did what I did, but there's an environmental justification or explanation, right? But to the extent there isn't, right, we make more of an internal attribution. It's like, wow, I laughed at that joke. I thought it was funny. I chose to laugh. Then we feel more responsible. And the greater the responsibility we feel, the greater the dissonance. Yeah. So if there are external circumstances, something at work, right, that we thought would affect our getting promoted or getting a raise, all that kind of stuff, or we feel like, someone have really been angry and, we feared for our lives or just, wanted to avoid a really unpleasant circumstance to that extent, we can attribute it to the environment. Yeah. Some practical environmental behavioral circumstance, the less we're likely to feel responsible, and the less responsible we feel, the less likely we will feel dissonance and feel compelled to change our attitude. But to the extent it's not so much the environment, but to the extent we feel like we made a choice and it's our responsibility, we're more likely to feel dissonance, and that dissonance will very well, not absolutely, right, but very well will lead to a reconfiguration, a modification of our attitudes and beliefs. All righty, so let me move here. All righty, so let's talk about social influence. Let me take a little brief Red Bull break. Thank you. So, social influence relates to the extent to which group situations, the number of people around us, the types of people around us, influence our attitudes and beliefs. All right, let's talk about conformity and obedience, two areas which have garnered a lot of social psychological research. So in terms of conformity, we do that all the time. I don't have to tell you this, in terms of how we speak, how we dress, how we behave. There are just, and just tons of ways in which our behavior, all of those are just human behavior, right? Dress, speech, what we say, are attempts to conform, right? There are certain many ways in which we don't conform, but if you count all the ways every day in our lives, we are conforming. We are conforming animals, all righty? We certainly have our moments of independent thought and autonomy and nonconformity, but most of the stuff we do are attempts to conform to rules and norms so that we can function in society. Yeah, we get reinforced for conformity when people when we're following the rules, be it work or class or social, right? We get reinforced for that powerfully by others. And group reinforcement is a powerful one. Yeah. When we are reinforced by the group, whether it's the family, friends, work, people at the bus stop, people at the mall, right? If they all frown and when they look at us, or they stop talking to us, or worse, right, get in our face or something, right? Those are powerful reinforcement or punishing situations, that affect our behavior. Now, in a very classic study by Arthur Ashe, this in 1955, this is an illustration of one of his studies. What Arthur Ashe did was he had a number of subjects, right, one at a time, so this would be a subject, right, be in a conference room with several other people. Now, the several other people were actors, all righty? The subject didn't know that they were actors, didn't know that these individuals, for example, were actors, okay, or confederates of the study, right? Not the subjects, but people who are pretending to act in a certain way. In his studies, and I believe here we just see a shot of a subject and two other people, but they typically, I think in Ash's study, he had about anywhere from 3 to 5 or several people, okay? In these studies, okay, the group ostensibly were told that the study was about perception. So they were showed different line lengths, right? So this was the kind of the line length they had to focus in on, and then they had to choose which of a set of lines the first initial stimulus was most similar to. Now here you can see that the answer is C, right? So in the initial presentation of stimuli, right, the subject would say like C, and the actors, right, would give the correct answer. Right? So they would give a number of different line lengths and so on. All righty. Now, Subjects were randomly assigned to either situations where, the group just answered correctly or to their best ability, or to a situation where um, uh, the uh, subject would make a guess, but then the actors would agree to get the wrong answer. Alrighty. So in other words, the subject was brought into a situation where a couple or more people gave what was clearly the wrong answer, right? But they would give a different answer than the individual, right? So the subject was left alone thinking about what they thought was the right answer, but others around them gave what was clearly the wrong answer. All righty. And what did Ash find? Ash found that in most situations, yeah, subjects would eventually conform or agree with the rest of the group, even if they were clearly wrong. Okay. At first, they would be a little distressed, like, "Hey, what's going on? This is clearly the same length as that." Yeah. But then when the actor started, but then after a few more trials, right, subjects very often would cave in and would conform or give the same answer as the rest of the group in most situations, not all. Yeah, in most situations. And this kind of study has played out in dozens, has been replicated in dozens of other studies. Yeah, which is again a big key hallmark feature of science, right? Replication, which allows for generalization. Yeah? So it played out in dozens, it's played out in various forms with lines and other things that an individual had to decide on as opposed to what the group would decide upon. All righty. So that we conform. So there's a lot of data to support that. Now, why do we conform? All right. Well, there are different types of conformity. There's informational versus normative. Okay. Now, normative is what we traditionally kind of think of with conformity. Yeah, that we do things like dress in a certain way, speak at a certain volume, and so on, keep a certain distance because it makes us feel normal, right? Or accepted, or we're doing what others are doing, right? We look like them or sound like them, and so on. Okay, that tends to make people feel comfortable, or it makes people feel comfortable, pleasure that they're like the rest of the group, that they're not standing out as the oddball who's talking too loud or too soft or dressing in a different way. Yeah. Um, as opposed to informational social influence. Yeah, when we act in a certain way because we think that by behaving a certain way, this will allow us to reach a certain objective besides matching the group. Yeah, normative social influence is about conforming with the group so that we're similar. Yeah, and that that the group will be attracted to us because we're similar to them. Yeah, so we'll be part of the norm, as opposed to informational, where we think, wow, people are behaving a certain way, and if I behave the same way, it will help me achieve a certain objective. Yeah. So, for example, let's just say in a certain mall, right? People who want to get into the movie theater, they all line up and they all line up against the wall. Okay, they could line up in a lot of ways, right in front of the ticket, and like a snake line. They could just group together in front of the ticket stand, or they line up right against the wall, right? That leads right into the entrance of the theater. So the person sees that and they go, "Oh, I guess I got to line up right against the wall," and so on. They might even see the people spaced, not socially distanced, but spaced out by 1 or 2 feet, and they go, "Oh, okay, that's the distance I ought to keep." With the idea that, oh, this is the behavior that will get me into the movie theater. It's not that I want to be liked or accepted or loved by the people online, yeah? But this seems to be the way to get me to the objective, which is getting to the movie theater. That's informational social influence. Okay, and so that's an important kind of difference, a distinction when examining conformity. Yeah, is it to be accepted into the group because you want a sense of kinship, togetherness, right? So, you wear the same school uniform and so on, or right, sometimes, right, back in Catholic school, right, some kids would wear the school uniform because that was a school rule, but then, loosen their tie and stuff. So then you would loosen, all boys school, you loosen your tie in the same way because you don't want to have it completely tight and look like like one of the teachers. You wanted to look like one of the students, right? So that was your little act of rebellion, make the tie a little loose and not tightly fit and all that kind of stuff. That's normative social influence. Alrighty. Whereas informational social influence is exemplified with the example I just provided there. Now, what increases conformity? Yeah, well, certainly, not certainly, but what a lot of the social psych research shows, all you need are three people. Yeah. So if one person, right, feels is in the presence of two others, how the two others may behave is enough of a social situation to get the one other person to conform. Kind of scary, alrighty, that you only need two people against one to start conforming behavior. Alrighty, and certainly the more people involved, it can increase. Okay, not necessarily exponentially, but increase the power of conformity. The more people who demonstrate a certain behavior. Alrighty, but there are other factors too. It's not simply just the number of people. Another factor is the extent to which the individual, right? Again, social psychology is focused on the individual kind of thinking and how they're affected by groups. To what extent the group or the people around them are objects of admiration. Yeah. So if one's in a group in a class and they feel like they're surrounded by a bunch of dummies, right, or low lives and stuff, they're less likely to conform. But if they feel like they're in a group of people who are like savvy, not intellectually, but just maybe street smart, yeah, or and here's or they seem to know it, they seem to be on top of it, we're more inclined to copy those people. The other is attractiveness. Yeah, and we're not necessarily talking about physical attractiveness. We may talk about personality attractiveness, whatever. But the extent to which the two or more other people are perceived as attractive, yeah, physical, emotional, behavioral, yeah, that we like these people, we want, and so on. Yeah, kind of similar to the admiration. Yeah, but we're just plain attracted to them now. We're more likely to conform. Okay. The other is the extent to which we can observe our own behavior. Yeah, so if we see ourselves in a video, we know a picture's being taken of us, we see ourselves in a reflection. Yeah. The more conscious we are of our behavior, yeah, this will influence conformity as well. Alrighty. Um, and and this can actually work in different ways. One way can actually, although it can increase conformity, yeah, depending on the behavior, yeah, especially if it's questionable how much we admire or are attracted to people. For observing our behavior, that can actually undercut conformity, yeah. But the extent to which we are conscious of our behavior, we're thinking about what we're doing in a reflection, in a picture, in a video, what have you, right? Then we're more likely, that's likely to increase conformity. And certainly culture can have a play. Yeah, culture being ethnic, racial, national, regional, gender, whatever the case may be, sexual orientation, right? That different cultures tend to foster conformity more than others. Okay. And like uh, American culture, American being those in North America and the United States, right? There's a lot of value to nonconformity. All right. Although we can be rest assured, people in the US conform all the damn time. All righty. Whereas in other countries, like let's say Germany or Japan, right, group conformity is valued more. Alrighty, although there's a lot of ways individuality is also reinforced in those countries as well. So I want to avoid any stereotypes of German and Japanese people, but cultures certainly vary in terms of degree of conformity to which its group conformity is valued. Alrighty, Now, on the matter of obedience, yeah, what I will probably send out to you guys is a link, probably this link, of a video regarding obedience. Now, the video is of a study by Stanley Milgram at Yale University, which was done, I think the video was done in 1963, where Milgram, right, set up a situation where subjects came to what they thought was a study about memory. Yeah. And they were told that they would be teachers, right? And in another room would be someone who'd be learning a certain sequence of words. And if they made a mistake, the teacher, the subject, would have to administer an electrical shock to the learner, alrighty, and so on, and then would have to administer increasingly higher levels of shocks. Yeah, which ranged from I think 15 watts to like 350 watts, right? And by the way, even a shock of 15 watts, right? Well, shocks generally suck, alrighty, but it, shocks of 15 to 45 watts, they really sting. So you can imagine, right, a shock of 350 watts, yeah, very painful, very painful, and that's what the teachers were instructed by the experimenter to do to the learner, and what many of the subjects and what happened that many of the subjects, the majority of them, right, about 63-ish% of them, right, would administer shocks of increasing wattage, yeah, over the learning trials to such an extent that by the end, they were administering the lethal level, which was like 450 watts if memory serves. Oh, it's right there on on the slide, 450 watts. So the question became, right, how did this happen? Yeah, this was 1963 in Yale, right, Connecticut, right? This was shortly after World War II, after the U.S. fought a war against the Japanese and the Germans, right, both imperialist and a fascist state, right? So these were American males, yeah, many of whom may have actually fought in World War II against, fascism, who were led by an experimenter to administer lethal levels of shock to a learner. Now, how could this happen? Why was there such a high degree of obedience? Yeah. Well, Milgram's proposition or theory was that obedience can occur, yeah, not because of weak-minded people, weak-minded personalities, or weak moral structures, but if you set up the right environmental circumstances, these things can happen. Yeah. So if you just get some people, right, a number of subjects, and set up a situation like this, you can get this kind of behavior most of the time. And that there are certain environmental circumstances that increase the probability of this behavior. So, for example, if the experimenter was in close proximity to the teacher, yeah, like being in the same room, you would get increased obedience, as opposed to if the experimenter were phoning in from another location. Okay, then you get much less obedience. To the extent the experimenter was perceived as a legitimate authority, if he was wearing a white lab coat, yeah, and looked like he was an MD or a researcher, you'd get increased obedience. Yeah, but you take off the lab coat, then less so, right? If the victim was at a distance, right, you get more obedience, right? If they're in the next room, but if they're in the same room, right, you'd get much less obedience. Alrighty. Now, by the way, I failed to mention this, but the learner in this situation was Tada, an actor, a confederate of the study. So he wasn't really getting shocked, right? But the important thing to keep in mind is that the teacher or the subject of the study believed that they were administering these shocks, that they were administering pain, lethal levels of shock. Another thing that affected obedience was whether there were any role models for defiance. Yeah. So, for example, if the teacher in this experiment was placed in a room, right, believing that they had to give shocks to the learner, the actor, but if there was another actor besides the experimenter in the room who would defy the experimenter, like say, hey, no ways, we're not going to do this, all that kind of stuff, then obedience was almost nil. Yeah. So kind of the lesson here is that if there's just one other person, yeah, who will defy an authority figure, yeah, you get much less obedience. But if no one does, right, it's as if everyone kind of looks at each other, right, or the person, right, the subject in this situation would look at the other person and go, well, they're not doing anything. Maybe I shouldn't do anything either. Yeah, that we might take in that information from the environment, right, looking at that other person, and that affects our behavior. Even though we normally wouldn't give shocks to people, we were in this environmental situation, authority figure who looks legitimate, Yale academic researcher in a white lab coat is telling me to do this, you know, that it's important for research, and I'm looking at another human being who's, going along with it. This must be okay. Um, and this is probably something I should do, which were many of the things that increased um, obedience. Okay, so we'll kind of bypass this, and we'll take a look at social relations. But here, let me just pause for a moment. Okay, everyone, thanks for your patience. Let's get back to where we last left off. And with that, let's talk about social relationships. Okay, big area in social psychology, no big surprise. And there are a lot of different areas of social relations. We're going to be talking about some of the ones that catch our attention the most, including prejudice and social attraction. Alrighty. Now, what is prejudice? Yeah, well, you probably heard this definition before in other classes. Um, Prejudice is really ultimately a prejudgment. Yeah, and it's usually an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude towards a group. Could be positive, right? The typical one we think is, seeing someone from a certain group and presuming they're less intelligent or less morally straight, right? Um, that person from such and such a racial ethnic group or nationality, they're just more uncouth or criminal or less intelligent, all those kinds of negative things. Yeah, but there are also prejudices which have a positive kind of connotation, yeah, or implication, right? But there are still prejudices, right? So presuming from someone from a certain ethnic racial group is a great athlete, yeah, or great musician, or funny, and all that kind of stuff, yeah. Um, Now, with prejudices usually come the prejudices usually come with the complexity of not only attitudes and beliefs, like some of the ones I just stated, but a lot of emotional associations too. Yeah, fear, dread, anger, um, love, sometimes unjustifiably so. Right? We think certain group is great because they're so whatever. Right? They have a certain attribute that we think is wonderful. Um, and what's particularly concerning is that how this may predispose us to act in a certain way, make decisions, right? Hire someone, not hire someone, promote and no, or not promote, yeah, and so on. Or this may affect our behavior in very subtle ways, like how much attention we give someone, yeah, how many questions we may ask them or engage them in. How long we hang out with them or otherwise. Yeah. In many ways, clearly that people are probably unaware of, yeah, unconscious of. And here I'm not talking about the Freudian unconscious, like slipped into repressed into the unconscious, right? With all the sexual violent wishes and stuff like that, but stuff that we just do automatically, yeah, without even thinking about it. Okay. Because it's easier. It helps us in complex situations when we categorize people. And that's certainly another value or function of prejudice, right? About whatever. right? It could be about ethnic race, gender, nationality, and so on. And heck, even in this day and age, what we're particularly struggling with um, is a prejudice based on political positions. Yeah, if you're identified as a liberal versus a conservative, or Democrat, Republican, or pro-Trump or anti-Trump, right? There comes a whole, whole bunch of baggage about who is what on the political spectrum, and we make prejudgments. It may affect how we like. Obviously, clearly, it affects for many people how much they like someone. They'll spend time with someone, and maybe in some bad situations, it affects behaviors like hiring or acceptance into programs and stuff like that. Okay, these are photos from a show that was called Black and White. And what the show, well, you know what? When we meet face to face, we'll talk about the show. I'll just leave it at that for now. And here's some other photos from the show. All righty. Now, certainly what is relevant here is the social psychological, well, it's not that social psychologists invented this, but they study it. Yeah, they study how this plays out and factors that contribute to the in-group versus out-group perceptions. Yeah, um, and thinking this way, right? Thinking about in-group or the out-group can foster in-group biases, right? So if we think someone is in our ethnic racial group or in our country or in our sexual orientation, right? This may foster not absolutely, but may foster bias in terms of how we think about that person, in terms of their intelligence, moral structure, whether they're just pleasant to be around with. And invariably, if we have those attitudes, right, certainly they may increase the probability of certain behaviors. All righty. And certainly, as I mentioned before, in-group, out-group has a big play right now in terms of the political divide that we have in the US. Now, another phenomenon, well studied, well researched in social psychology, is the notion of scapegoating. Yeah? Now, scapegoating is the idea of identifying, right, either in a group, an individual, or maybe identifying a group as the scapegoat, right? The group, the individual group to blame, right? For particular circumstances. So in a country, it may be perception of a certain group like immigrants, or not immigrants, maybe a subgroup within the majority group that, oh, if they weren't here, we wouldn't have these economic problems, right? They become the focus of blame, that whatever circumstances we're unhappy with, if it were not for that individual or that group, we wouldn't have these problems. Yeah. And scapegoating actually arises from an Old Testament notion, yeah, that the ancient Hebrews, right, as they were wandering the desert, right, would practice this when something bad was occurring, right, like lousy weather, right, or bad series of unfortunate events, right, that for the ancient Hebrews, this nomadic group, right, that they would identify literally a literal goat and then kick that goat out from the group. All right, so they have to wander off on its own, poor little goat. Okay, but the idea that the goat would just leave the group and die. And then with the death of the actual literal goat, right, the bad karma or bad stuff that was happening would disappear, and bad weather would disappear and good weather would appear. Okay, it was this kind of nomadic, tribal, kind of superstitious practice, okay, which, is the origin of the idea, or related to the idea of scapegoating that we do in social situations. Yeah. And this plays out in a lot of forms. It could be, in the work situation, social situation, where if that individual or that group weren't here, if they only left, we would be better off. Yeah. And it's a powerful social group dynamic, yeah, which fosters group integrity or cohesion, right? So if you see an individual or group, a subgroup as being a problem, it actually brings the group together. It's a powerful although, as described, it certainly is a problematic situation. It has a function. It's not just people want to be mean or nasty. It's the idea that by thinking this way, yeah, it brings the group together, right? In particular, in terms of the group's values or norms or objectives. All righty. Um, Now, what's another example? Another example might be even like, let's think of high school, right? The kid that people thought was less attractive or not as good an athlete, or even in the chess club, right? The kid who wasn't perceived as the best chess player. Now, objectively speaking, right, there people certainly maybe vary on all these parameters, but with scapegoating, where that becomes a problem, is when the group identifies that person or individuals as being bad, is ostracized with the wish or the hope that they would leave the group, leave our high school, leave the party, leave the chess club, leave the football team, because we would be so much better if they were gone. Yeah. So it's the idea that by thinking this way and acting in ways that pushes out that individual subgroup, that it brings the larger group together. Yeah, because of our goals to be the best chess club, the best football team, to be a very pretty, handsome group of people, whatever that desired objective is. All righty. So it has powerful. So it's a powerful group dynamic, right? It's not just about being mean or nasty. All righty. And that's why we still have it in varying forms. Yeah, very often. It's because it's something that it's adaptive. It brings the group together. Now, what are some cognitive roots or bases for thinking of an in-group versus out-group? Yeah. Well, one goes back to what we had spoken about or touched on in the chapter on developmental psychology. Yeah, is that our brains develop to categorize, and we have just dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of categories in our head. And when we think of the in-group versus out-group, that's just another way we try to make sense of the complexity in our world, right? It's a way to kind of simplify things so that we can feel that the world is more organized, less chaotic, more predictable. It makes us feel more, and all those things make us feel more comfortable. Yeah, and that's powerful negative reinforcement, right? Because if the world seems unpredictable, that's a negative feeling. But if we can say, oh, black people are that way or white people are that way, it seems more predictable, organized, simplified, reduces that tension, and that's negative reinforcement, right? So when that negative tension is removed, that aversive stimulus removed, what's reinforced is that belief that white people are this way, black people, whatever, Latino, Asian are that way. It reinforces that belief. Yeah, very powerful. The other thing, cognitively speaking, is that vivid cases stand out for us, right? When we collect data from our observational experience. Yeah, this kind of goes back to the chapter on cognition, intelligence, and language. And when we spoke about how vivid cases like an airline crash, right, stand out in our heads, as opposed to tens of thousands of, when we hear about tens of thousands of highway accidents and those leading to, fatalities, right? What sticks out in our mind is the plane crash. So we, think, oh, if I got to travel somewhere, I better go by car, not by plane. Whereas, going by car is far safer. Right? But the vivid cases stand out. And that might be the case too when we, think of certain in-group, out-group prejudices, right? Homosexuals being a certain way, or transgendered people, right? Transgender people being gregarious or loud, right? Because what stands out are the vivid cases we recall from television or the media, as opposed to maybe many of those cases where a transgendered person is not gregarious, all right, or loud and so on. We don't remember that, right? We don't remember the quiet transgender person. We remember the loud, obnoxious one, all righty? Another thing that affects the in-group, out-group phenomenon is this related phenomenon, just the just world phenomenon. So what is that? It's the belief that the world is just, that things are the way they are because people, groups acted in a certain way that explains why they're in their situation. Women acted in a way. Uh, that explains their status, right? Certain ethnic minority groups acted in a way that explains the situation because we don't like to think, right, how our group, right, that's not that how our in group may have had a play, or how we as individuals may have had a play, or how just environmental and historical other circumstances, but outside of any individual group's control, had a play. Right? It's easier to think that a person or group has experienced something because of their personal responsibility and choices they made. Yeah. Now, in some cases, right, that's true, but in many cases, that may not be the true. May not be true. Maybe due to other factors, environmental factors, historical, political factors, and so on. Okay. Well, let's move to another social psychological area of research interest, and maybe something a little more pleasant and fun to talk about: attraction, right? So when we're attracted to someone physically or in terms of behaviors, right? They're attracted because they seem smart or seem like a good leader. What are some of the things that affect how we're attracted to people? Yeah, either as friend, and attraction is broad. It affects a lot of things, right? We first think of romantic stuff like dating and getting married and all that kind of stuff, but certainly affects friendships, even acquaintances, right? Which people will hang out with more, but they may not even be friends. It may affect, obviously work situations, maybe even family situations, right? What family members we like to hang out with more than others. Now, what are some of the things that affect attraction? Yeah. Well, a big one, yeah, which has a huge influence is just simply proximity. Yeah, those who we encounter more, yeah, we're more likely to find attractive, and those who we have very little contact with, we're less attracted to. Yeah. And gee, just laying it out like that, you can probably come up with tons of examples. Yeah, that and this can play out, for example, you're being in a class, yeah, and maybe you're being attracted to some people in class, not necessarily romantic, but could be romantic, or just as friends or wanting to hang out with, that you would have had no interest in, but for the fact that you see these people every week. That breeds attraction, everything being equal. Yeah, presuming that they're not coming in, smelling like garbage or anything like that, or they're not coming in and always punching you in the arm. Everything being equal, right? Proximity, yeah, increases the probability that you'll be more attracted to them. Okay, um, and it's probably the most powerful predictor of friendship. Yeah. And there's tons of research to support this. This plays out in all kinds of ways. Yeah. One uh, related phenomenon is the mere exposure effect. Yeah. That everything being equal, repeated exposure to a new stimulus increases liking for it. And this plays out. There's tons of market research in the hundreds that shows this to be true. Yeah. One of the greatest predictors of political wins are um, go to exposure, right? In terms of billboards, advertisements, television. I mean, that's why you get all those stupid mailings. I hate those mailings, political mailings in your box, right? Because just the mere presence of those boxes, when you see, John Smith, his name and, his picture, whenever I get those, I just chuck it in the garbage, right? But the mere fact that you were engaged for 1 second, right? Maybe a second and a half with the John so and so, right? Increases the likelihood that that John so and so will win. That's why it's done. It's not done because it increased. If it didn't work, people wouldn't be doing it. But it's been going on for decades. Why? Because the political research shows that the mere exposure of a political candidate increases the likelihood that she or he will win. That's why you see those ugly billboards. That's why we see so many ads. And one of the greatest predictors, yeah, fairly consistent. Yeah, not 100% guaranteed, but because so many things can happen in a political campaign. But everything being equal, right? The person who has the highest amount of money in their campaign fund is more likely to win. And why is that? It was not just about money, right? Which, you know, it's probably some indicator of people's interest or investment in the person. So there are a lot, so it's related to that, but it's also related to how those monies are are frequently used, and a big bulk of those monies, the big bulk of the money is used towards advertisements. Yeah, so that's one of the best predictors of who's going to win, who has the most money in their campaign, because it's related to advertisement. Right? Uh, right, and there are some songs, right, you never cared for when you first heard them, but they're played over and over to some medium, and you just get kind of used to it. That's the mere exposure effect. Same thing with people, right? Everything being equal, the more you see someone, the more likely you'll be attracted to them. Other things that affect attraction is similarity. Yeah. So the extent to which people see themselves as being similar, and similar, and you could be similar to someone along a myriad of parameters. Yeah. Could be physical, right? Ethnic, racial, height, weight. Yeah. Could be national, could be gender, could whatever, right? So a lot of certain physical, well, national is not physical, but but could be a number of physical parameters, could be a lot of non-physical ones, right? You both like the Dallas Cowboys, or you're both from the same country, and so on. Yeah, and the more similar we perceive people to be to us, the more likely or be attracted to them. Everything being equal, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if we're the same race, same height, same weight, right? If they punch us in the gut or they smell like garbage, we're not going to be attracted to them, right? But everything being equal, right? The more variables you have in common, the more likely you'll be attracted to them, right? We find this in romantic relationships, dating and marriage. Still, in most countries and in the U.S., most marriages are within the same racial ethnic group. Now, that is also changing, though, where at this point, about 5 to 7% of marriages across the U.S. Are across ethnic racial lines. And by the way, in Hawaii, though, very different among all the states, half of marriages are across ethnic racial lines. Alrighty. To the extent we find ourselves closer in age, level of education, religion is a huge one. Yeah. Um, and even mental and physical disabilities. Yeah, to the extent people may have certain, uh, emotional difficulties like being anxious or depressed, and physical disabilities, like even just wearing glasses. People are more attracted to people. Other people have glasses too. Now, physical attractiveness, yeah, it certainly has an impact on how attracted, how drawn we are to people. Alrighty. Now, it's not the only factor, but it is a major predictor of liking in first impressions. Alrighty. Now, this certainly plays out in romantic relationships, but this occurs in friendships and applying for a job, in political campaigns, right? So the more physically attracted the person is perceived, right, the more likelihood that we're attracted to them. You may recall, I think in class I had mentioned, there's no small coincidence why uh, very few politicians have mustaches and beards, right? Because that's perceived by more people as being less attractive. Yeah, they're a little concerned about the person with the facial hair, right? As a general matter, I mean, so but there are a lot of people like it, but there are more people tend to not like it. Yeah, tend to like a clean shaven face on males. Yeah, that's why no big surprise. You rarely see. There are some, right? Politicians, but the vast majority, if you just look at presidents, very few presidents have had facial hair. Okay, for that reason, not all, but most. Okay. In a study done by Elaine Hatfield, a social psychologist at UH Manoa back in the 60s, yeah, freshmen were randomly assigned and paired up with other freshmen for a dance. Alrighty, the dance lasted just a few hours one evening. And then later, after the dance, the students were asked if they would like to meet the person they were randomly assigned to again, and rated the person along different parameters, physical and non-physical. And the best predictor of whether the person wanted to meet up with the person again was physical attractiveness. Okay. Um, so it is a physical attractiveness is a major predictor in liking it, particularly with first impressions. Now, what sustains a relationship down the road certainly are other variables. Yeah, having certain things in common, being able to manage problem solve together, how conflicts are managed, communication. So it's not to say other things don't matter, but when it comes to first impressions, yeah, for obvious reasons, physical attraction, that's the main thing. That's the main thing you have to work with, right? You don't have problem solving, communication style, conflict management. You don't have that yet in the first 15 minutes you meet someone, right? On the first date or the first party or whatever, right? The biggest thing you have before you is what you see, all right? So maybe no big surprise, right? But there's actually research to support that. So it's not just common sense or a good idea. It's actually supported by data. Okay. In meta-analytic studies, right, which are studies which kind of compile dozens, if not hundreds of studies together to figure out statistically what's the overall finding, um, men tend to value physical features more than women on average, but not always. Yeah. That said, this might be more of a self-report phenomenon. In other words, uh, other research seems to indicate, yeah, that when you don't ask women to what extent physical attractiveness matters, but you measure their physical attractiveness to other partners by other means, not by self-report, that women value physical attractiveness just as much as men do. Alrighty. Alrighty then, let's talk about altruism. What is altruism? Well, the notion of altruism is that it refers to the phenomenon of people's willingness to help others without getting any kind of direct reinforcement, all right, without any kind of pay or pat on the back, just to help because it's pleasurable to help, okay? Yeah, the argument is maybe altruism never truly exists because we always are kind of reinforced, even though we may not be directly reinforced with a pat on the back or money or something like that, that we always kind of will self-reinforce because we feel good about having it done, something like that. Okay. But it's also generally characterized as unselfish regard for the welfare of others. Alrighty, so maybe a classic example you might think of is someone who, is walking past a Walmart and sees someone sitting on the street, begging for some change, and then the person hands them $5, right? And then doesn't expect anything else, but just is happy that they were able to help someone else. Okay, so that kind of regard for others' welfare. Um, Now, when do we help others? Yeah, so when do we kind of run to the cause and kind of run to someone's assistance, right? If they've fallen, if they seem to be harassed by somebody and so on, or if they seem to be lost and they seem to need help. Well, there are certain parameters that predict whether bystanders will intervene. Yeah, one is if they just plain notice the situation. If they don't notice it, right? If it's out of view, right? Or they're walking quickly past someone and they don't notice, right? Really take into account that someone's sitting there begging for money, they're less likely to intervene. Alrighty. There may be other situation, and another factor is whether one interprets the situation as one requiring their assistance. Yeah. So if someone is standing in the middle of standing on a sidewalk, looking left and right, some people might interpret that as someone being lost and needing help. Others may interpret that as, that's how you get around town. You stand and you look at left and right sometimes. So I do not interpret that as, you might say to yourself, that person doesn't need help. They're just standing on the street. I do that all the time. In the former situation, you're more likely to get bystander intervention. In the latter, you're probably not. Yeah. Also, to the extent to which you take responsibility, you think you had a play, or you're somehow connected, or you need to do something. Yeah, people vary in their attitudes and beliefs about to the extent they need to. They're responsible for the person who's sitting on the street begging for cash. Yeah, and people vary along for various reasons in terms of their personal responsibility for that. All righty. The textbook also talks about the bystander effect. I'll just leave it to the text discussion on that matter. And when we have an increased probability of helping, kind of touched on that. But the text will discuss other circumstances that increase the probability of helping. And with that, that's all I have to say about chapter on social psychology. And with that, as usual, thank you for your attention, the privilege of your attention. And with that, I'll see you in class, and I will also see you again on another YouTube video lecture. All right? Very good, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.